I apologize for doing this when it's so late. I'm sure people are tired, but I think it's important for one answer to be said to the gentleman who made the very fine point earlier in this part of the sessions, that it's important to know what was done in the institutions of higher learning in relation to knowing something about the history of Jews in Eastern Europe. And I promise you it would be no longer than 10 minutes. It's, of course, tremendous. What we're doing right here is tremendously important to keep the memory of what happened in the Holocaust alive. That anybody who denies that, I think, is denying something very important. But I think it is equally important to remember that what the Holocaust destroyed was a period of tremendous creativity of the Jewish people. A time that was so creative that many of the things that they started in the 19th century are things that are going along in the center of Jewish learning today. The first thing that I want to talk about is the establishment of the enormously high level of Jewish learning in Vilnius, or rather in those days it was called Vilna, in Lithuania, headed by a figure who played an enormous role in Jewish intellectual history, the Gaon. The Gaon, of course, was tremendously erudite in the areas of Jewish education. The legends about him said that if he stuck a pin in the cover of a book of the Talmud, he could tell exactly on not only what page the point of the pin rested, but even what letter. Now, whether this was actually tested or not, I don't know. But the important thing is that it was said about him, and it was said to indicate the enormously high level of Jewish study at that time. And of course, the belief was that the most important thing about Jewish life was learning, and was learning about the holy books, about the books which were the tradition of the Jewish people back to biblical times. This went on, of course, for quite a few years, but it was answered by a movement among Jews in Eastern Europe that was equally important, headed by a man whose title was the Baal Shem Tov, that is to say, the master of the good name. The Baal Shem Tov was obviously a man of enormous charisma, who could talk with great conviction to the vast majority of Jewish people, and his argument was exactly the opposite of the Gaon. He said Judaism is not just the study of books put away in a room, dry language. No, Judaism is a tradition of joy. Judaism is a tradition of expression of the highest type of creativity of human beings. It's music, it's prayer, it's stories, it's literature, it's everything that's the highest part of Jewish learning. Of course, this was in very straight opposition to the idea of the Gaon, the idea of the people who followed the Gaon, who thought that learning was the most important part. The movement that the Baal Shem Tov started is a movement that I'm sure you all know about. It was called the Hasidim. And of course, in reaction to the Hasidim, the movement in relation to the Gaon was called the Misnagdim, that is, those who were opposed. The dialectic that took place between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim was one of the most creative times, one of the most creative movements in all of Judaism. As if that weren't enough, something like 10 or 15 years later, when the conflict between the two of them was at its height, another movement came into Eastern Europe, partly started by German Jews and partly encouraged by Jews in Eastern Europe. The idea was that Jews should become a part of European culture. They shouldn't isolate themselves from what was happening in the European universities, that they should enlighten themselves. Well, you had the Russian word here today, просвещение. The idea was the enlightenment. The Jews should enlighten themselves by being not only educated by their own tradition, but should also master the tremendous advancements that were being made in European universities. They should take on the European languages. They should take on the European dress. They should become both Jews and also the highest producers of Western civilization. When this came about, of course, the Hasidim and the Misnagdim, who up to that time had been enemies, suddenly came together to fight against the Haskalah, to fight against the so-called prosvещение. No, we did not want to become part of the European culture. This meant assimilation, and they were against assimilation. And so, again, you had a fight between the two of them, and this fight, again, produced some of the most creative works that have been ever produced in Jewish history. As if that weren't enough, there were others who came along who were in favor of other movements. There were the socialists, led by the so-called Jüdische Arbeitersbund, that's the Jewish Workers' Association, which believed in socialism, which believed that it was a kind of the Jewish form of Marxism which should take over the Jewish people. And of course, they were entirely opposed not only to what the Haskalah was doing, but also to the Misnagdim and the Hasidim. And of course, if that weren't enough, again, you had the Zionist movement, which came along with Theodor Herzl after the Beilis trial in Russia. After the Dreyfus trial in France, decided that it would be impossible for Jews to be a part of European civilization. What the Jews had to do was to create their own land, their own nation, and of course, Zionism came into play. And what was even more ironic in a way, that up to right around that time, the Hebrew language had been reestablished as a kind of I think I have 2 minutes left. The Hebrew language had been established to try to wean the Jews away from the language of Yiddish that they were speaking, in order that they too could be not only a part of the ancient biblical tradition, but also a part of the new European tradition. And of course, although what they had in mind was weaning the Jews from Yiddish to Hebrew and then from Hebrew to Russian, as a matter of fact, Hebrew turned out to be the perfect modem for Jewish nationalism of Zionism. So you had Zionism, you had socialism, you had Haskalah, you had Hasidim, you had Misnagdim. I challenge you to take another century of learning of any other people in the world and tell me that there was the same creativity, the same attempt to really make the human mind and the human spirit go as high as it possibly could go as what was going on among the Jews in the 19th century. It's a terrible tragedy that this was in part destroyed, of course, by the revolutions that took place in the 20th century, and even worse, of course, by the hideous Nazi reality that took place in World War II. But what I think is tremendously important is for us to remember, as much as we remember the Holocaust, and we should remember the Holocaust, as much as we remember that, we should also remember the enormously powerful creativity of the Jewish people at that time. And each one of those movements, if you want to look at the United States, if you want to look at any other place where Jews are active today, these movements are like yeast, which is boiling, which is creating new ideas, new movements, and new creativity among the Jewish people. Let us remember that as much as we remember the Holocaust. Thank you. The reason I do this is that I taught this course at Northwestern University for something like 30 years. The statement was made, it wasn't done very much in institutions of higher learning. I want you to know that one of the top 10 American universities had that course going for at least 30 years.